Can you please read the first sentence under subparagraph A?
Yes. Sanctity of life and the protection of the public shall be the cornerstones of the MPD's use of force policy.
What does that mean?
Of all the things that we do as peace officers for the Minneapolis Police Department, and I mentioned the thousands of calls that our men and women respond to, it is my firm belief that the one singular incident we will be judged forever on will be our use of force. And so, while it is absolutely imperative that our officers go home at the end of their shift, we want to make sure and ensure that our community members go home too. And so sanctity of life is absolutely vital, that is the pillar for our use of force.
Has this generally always been the case with Minneapolis use of force policy?
It is not.
When did that change?
We implemented this particular in 2016.
Has the training and use of force and application of use of force policy been imparted, including this philosophy, onto police officers in training at the training center?
It certainly has, yes.
Does the policy itself define force? What is force?
Yes, it does.
If we could take a look at Exhibit 217, I'll publish that. If you'd highlight use of force. Okay, generally speaking, what is force?
It can be any physical contact. It can be with a weapon. It could be with a vehicle. But it's any sort of physical contact that is more likely to render harm or injury to someone.
Is the use of restraint considered force?
That would be considered force.
And what type of force is authorized under departmental policy?
We under 609, we operate under the use of force, the Graham v. Connor statute, objectively reasonable force.
And if I could display Exhibit 217. Let's see. First, go back to 5-303. 5-303 authorizes force, is that right? And you'd mentioned 60906, state statute authorizing force under certain circumstances, is that right?
Yes.
And the phrase that's used for the authorization of force is what type of force?
Reasonable.
And that force can be authorized under certain circumstances, is that right?
Yes.
All right. So now if you would go to the next page, and let's talk about the circumstances under which a police officer is authorized properly to use force. If you highlight that. What are the circumstances under which an officer is authorized to use force?
An officer is authorized to use force effecting a lawful arrest, executing a legal process, enforcing an order of the court, and any other duties imposed upon that officer.
And that term reasonable force is further delineated in the policy, is that right?
Yes.
If we take a look at Exhibit 217, I believe under the definition, objectively reasonable force. Could you please read that definition?
Yes. The amount and type of force that would be considered rational and logical to an objective officer on the scene, supported by facts and circumstances known to an officer at the time the force was used.
Oh, you discussed a case, the Connor, right? The Connor factors. And I'd like you to, well, first of all, does the policy reference the Connor factors that you just mentioned?
Yes.
If you could display 217, page 2. Okay. And we have 3 bullet points here under the Connor factors, and that is the officer is supposed to look at the totality of the circumstances, right?
Yes.
And the 3 bullets here that the officer is supposed to consider are what?
The officer should consider the severity of the crime at issue, whether the suspect poses an immediate threat to the safety of the officers or others, and whether he is actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade arrest by flight.
And fair to say these three different considerations are things that you can attribute to the subject, correct?
Yes.
That's the subject's conduct, not someone else's.
Yes.
And of course, it has to be judged by a reasonable police officer on the scene at the time, correct?
Yes.
Now, do you recall, and obviously you're here talking about what happened on May 25, 2020, involving George Floyd. Do you recall why the officers were responding to cup foods on that date? The original reason for the call?
The original reason for the call was a response regarding a counterfeit situation at the store at the intersection of 38th and Chicago.
In terms of the deployment of your resources at the Minneapolis Police Department and as chief, how do you rate, I guess, the severity of that offense, the seriousness of that offense?
It would probably not rise to the level of, and particularly in light of last year, the level of violent crime that we've experienced in the city, but we would certainly respond to it, but it would not rise to the level in terms of severity of the crime here.
In looking at the particular type of crime, is that one for which a suspect is typically taken into a custodial arrest?
Typically not.
And why is that?
If it's not a violent felony, we also, in coordination with our jail system and our courts, there's been a shift over the years to make sure that the individuals who are going to jail are those who, from a public safety standpoint, need to be at least in that facility in the Hennepin County Jail. And if we can properly identify and it's not a violent situation, we can always charge via complaint and other things. And so that's one of the reasons why.
You use the phrase, I guess, violent felony. What's the more important part, whether it's violent or whether it's a felony?
Well, violence.
Why is that?
Well, it can certainly endanger not only the officers but the community.
Where something that's merely labeled a felony may or may not require a full custodial arrest.
That is correct.
And are Minneapolis police officers trained in the use of force?
Yes.
In the pre-service, in the academy, and also in post-service at the in-service training?
Yes.
And are officers taught the standard that force must be reasonable at the time it is applied?
Yes.
The entire time it's applied?
Yes.
Are officers taught the need to assess and reassess and reevaluate situations in the field?
Yes, we are.
Are you familiar with Minneapolis Police Department's critical thinking model?
Yes.
How are you familiar with that?
It was something that I wanted to embark and make sure that it was part of our training curriculum that also includes the aspects of procedural justice. And procedural justice is really, it's actually research and evidence-based learning that has shown that if police departments treat people with respect, give them voice, establish neutral engagements, and build areas of trust, our communities are more likely to cooperate with us. We're likely to be seen more as legitimate. It is actually shown that our employees come to work, their wellness is better, and so this is very important work. And so it's part of that procedural justice I just mentioned, is part of that critical thinking in our training.